He left me for someone better. Months later, my silence became the revenge he never saw coming. So last Friday night, while I was stitching up a kid who'd fallen off his bike, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't check it right away. When you're an ER nurse, a text can wait. But after the kid's mom thanked me through tears, I finally looked down at the screen. It was from my husband, Ben. Just 8 words. "Don't call me tonight. I found someone who understands me." At first, I thought it was some kind of sick joke. Ben wasn't the funny type, but still, he wouldn't drop something like that over text, right? Then I saw the timestamp. 8:42 p.m., same minute he usually picked me up from work. My stomach dropped so hard it almost hurt to breathe. The sound of the monitors around me suddenly felt louder. My coworker, Kelly, noticed I went pale and asked if I was okay. I smiled, that automatic nurse smile, and said, "Just another Friday," but inside something snapped. It wasn't anger yet. It was silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Ben and I had been together 11 years. We met in college. I was studying nursing. He was the loud guy who thought sarcasm was a personality. Back then, he used to tell me, "You're the calm in my chaos." I thought it was romantic. Now it just sounded ironic. I drove home in silence, headlights slicing through the rain. Every red light felt like the universe mocking me. Stop, wait, think. When I walked into our house, the one we'd painted together, it already felt like someone else's home. There was a half-empty whiskey glass on the counter, and a smell of his cologne, but faint, fading. He'd packed fast. I knew him well enough to know he wouldn't leave neatly. He never did anything neatly. The bedroom closet was half-empty. My favorite mug, the one he always used for his bad days, was gone too. That made me laugh, bitterly. He took the mug. He left the vows. I sat down on the floor, still in my scrubs, staring at the message. "Someone who understands me." You know that kind of phrase that sounds innocent but cuts deep? It's like he was saying all those years I listened, comforted, sacrificed, didn't count. Like I'd been speaking the wrong language the whole marriage. The next morning, I went to work early. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I stitched, I smiled, I functioned. Because that's what women like me do. We keep saving everyone else while bleeding quietly inside. But around noon, I found myself standing at the sink, scrubbing my hands long after the soap was gone, just watching the water run clear. It felt like I was washing him off my skin. That night, I didn't cry, not once. I just sat on the couch with the TV off and thought about how funny it was. How men like Ben always say they want someone who understands them. But what they really want is someone who doesn't challenge them. Someone softer, smaller, easier. And I realized something. Maybe I never stopped understanding him. Maybe he just stopped being worth understanding. 2 days after that text, I turned off my phone and left it that way. No calls, no social media, no pity messages from friends asking, "What happened?" I just disappeared for a bit. Because when your whole world falls apart, the last thing you want is other people watching the debris. At work, nobody knew. I pulled double shifts in the trauma unit, moving from one patient to another, living on coffee and adrenaline. The funny thing about being a nurse is that you can lose everything at home and still have to smile while telling someone's mother that her son will make it through surgery. Pain doesn't get a day off. One night, after a 14-hour shift, I found myself reorganizing the supply closet. Kelly caught me there and said, "Girl, you've been alphabetizing syringes for 30 minutes. You okay?" I told her, just trying to make sense of something. She didn't press, bless her heart. Sometimes silence says enough. Every time I went home, I noticed new absences. His favorite jacket gone. The framed photo from our trip to Big Sur missing from the wall. At first, it hurt like a paper cut you can't stop reopening. Then one night, I realized something strange. The apartment was finally quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels lonely, but the kind that feels like peace. I started doing things I hadn't done in years. I played the records he said were too depressing. I cooked pasta at midnight because no one was there to complain about carbs. I slept diagonally across the bed just because I could. It sounds silly, but those small rebellions felt like therapy. A week later, I stopped by the bank during my lunch break and split our joint account. The teller looked at me like she expected me to cry. Instead, I smiled. "Half," I said. "No drama, just fair." She nodded, typed something, and said quietly, "Good for you." That tiny moment, a stranger's validation, hit me harder than any apology Ben could have given. Then came the locks. My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, saw me struggling with the screwdriver and offered help. He was in his 70s, a retired firefighter with shaky hands and a heart too kind for this world. "You changing locks, sweetheart?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Turns out mine weren't as secure as I thought." He laughed softly. "They never are." By the time we finished, I had new keys and a new kind of strength. The next morning, I poured my coffee into the mug he didn't take and sat on the balcony watching the sunrise. I realized I'd spent years waiting for someone to make me feel safe, when all along I could have built my own safety. Of course, Ben tried to reach out. 53 missed calls, a dozen texts. "You're overreacting. It's not what you think. We need to talk." But every message felt like him trying to rewrite a story that was already finished. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The first time I laughed again was at the grocery store. I was buying ice cream, mint chocolate chip, the one he used to call toothpaste flavor. The cashier, a teenager with pink hair, asked if I was celebrating something. "Yeah," I said. "Freedom." Over the next few weeks, I noticed small shifts. I stood straighter. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. I said no without explaining why. Even my coworkers started noticing. One day, Dr. Patel, one of the senior surgeons, pulled me aside and said, "I don't know what changed, but whatever it is, keep it." That felt good, not because he noticed, but because I didn't need him to. Then came the phone call from Ben's mom. "He made a mistake," she said, her voice dripping with guilt and entitlement. "You two built a life together. You can't just throw it away over one bad decision." I almost laughed. "Ma'am," I said, "it wasn't one bad decision. It was 100 small ones that I ignored because I thought loyalty meant silence." She didn't know what to say. Silence again, my new favorite weapon. The next Sunday, I met my best friend Laura for brunch. She ordered mimosas before I could even sit down. "Okay," she said, "you're glowing, spill." I told her about the text, the locks, the ice cream. She stared at me, half horrified, half impressed. "You didn't even cry?" I shrugged. "Not in front of anyone, no." Then she grinned. "Girl, that's power." And maybe it was, maybe healing isn't dramatic. Maybe it's just quiet moments of choosing yourself over and over until it becomes muscle memory. That night, I went for a drive through downtown Portland. The city lights reflected off the wet pavement, everything shimmering like it was brand new. I passed the coffee shop where Ben and I had our first date. For a second, I thought I'd feel sad. Instead, I smiled. That girl who fell for him at 23, she didn't know her own strength yet. I did now. By the time I parked back home, it hit me. I wasn't rebuilding from ashes. I was building something entirely new. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't scared of the quiet. I was finally ready to hear myself think. It happened on a Wednesday. I remember because the rain hadn't stopped since morning, and Portland looked like it was drowning in its own sadness. I'd just gotten home after a long day when my phone started buzzing. One call, then another, then another. 53 missed calls by the time I set it down. All from Ben, the man who'd texted me 2 weeks ago saying he'd found someone who understood him. I didn't pick up. I just stared at the screen, half expecting it to burst into flames from how desperate he sounded. Then came the messages. Walls of text, switching between begging and blaming. "We need to talk." "You're being cold." "I made a mistake. Please, pick up." I didn't. Instead, I made tea. Lemon and honey, my comfort drink since childhood. While the kettle whistled, another text came in. "I'm outside." I walked to the window, and sure enough, his truck was parked across the street. He looked small. The kind of small that only comes from ego deflation. He was drenched, pacing, like some tragic hero in a movie he thought he was starring in. Part of me wanted to open the door, to ask why. But then I remembered all those nights I sat at that same window, waiting for him to come home, wondering what I'd done wrong. So I didn't move. I just watched. He called again. I finally picked up. Not to talk, but to end it. "Ben," I said, my voice calm in a way that scared even me. "Whatever you're looking for, it's not here anymore." He went quiet. Then came that familiar guilt trip tone. "You're really just gonna throw everything away? 11 years? I almost laughed. "You threw it first," I said. I just stopped catching. And then I hung up. He stood there another 10 minutes before driving off. When the headlights disappeared, I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just stood there in the half-dark, realizing that sometimes closure isn't a conversation. It's a locked door. A few days later, Kelly from work handed me a small brown envelope. "Someone left this for you at the front desk," she said. Inside was Ben's old leather notebook, the one he used to keep when he wanted to journal his thoughts. I hadn't seen it in years. Curiosity got me. That night I opened it. And God, boss, it was like reading a stranger's confession. Pages full of self-pity, half-truths, and weird little notes about me. Things like, "Emma's too independent, it makes me feel unnecessary. She doesn't need me, maybe that's why I feel invisible. Sometimes I wish she'd just fail once, so I could save her." I stopped breathing for a second. That was it. It wasn't that he didn't feel understood. It was that he couldn't stand being seen. I wasn't too cold, I wasn't too strong. He was just too small to stand next to me without feeling like less. You ever realize a truth so sharp it almost makes you laugh? That's what it felt like. I actually laughed out loud. I poured myself a glass of wine, flipped through those pages again, and said out loud, "Well, Ben, congratulations. You finally made me speechless." The next morning, I brought the notebook to work and left it in my locker. Kelly noticed the smirk on my face and asked what was up. "Nothing," I said. "Just found out the man who left me for someone who understood him didn't even understand himself." She let out a low whistle. "Girl, that's poetic." Later that week, he tried again, this time through email. "I'm sorry," it said. "She wasn't who I thought she was. You were right about everything. I messed up." I stared at that message for a long time, then typed 3 words. Then "stay gone," and hit send. That night, I went out with Laura and Kelly to this small jazz bar downtown. The kind with dim lights, good whiskey, and people who didn't care who you were. The band started playing "Fly Me to the Moon," and something inside me loosened. Laura raised her glass. "To Emma," she said, "the woman who wouldn't break." I smiled. "Nah," I told her, "just the woman who finally got tired of fixing things she didn't break." When I got home, I noticed my apartment smelled like lavender and peace. For months, I'd been scared of that silence. Now I craved it. I opened the window, let the rain in, and realized the craziest thing. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Ben, not at myself, just free. Sometimes the loudest revenge isn't yelling, blocking, or posting cryptic quotes online. It's living quietly, beautifully, without explanation. And that's when it hit me. I didn't lose anything. He did. 6 months later, my life looked nothing like the one I'd built with Ben. The apartment was lighter, warmer. The walls didn't echo anymore. They hummed. I'd started volunteering at a local clinic on weekends, teaching new nurses how to stay calm under pressure. Turns out I was good at it, real good. They even offered me a senior coordinator position last month. It felt like the universe was saying, "See? You were never hard to love, just surrounded by small minds." It was early fall when I saw him again. I was grabbing coffee before my shift when I heard someone say my name behind me. That familiar voice that used to make me turn, but now just made me tired. I turned anyway. And there he was, standing by the pastry counter like a ghost who hadn't realized he was dead. He looked older, not by age, but by regret. His hair was messy, the kind of messy that says, "I don't sleep much." And that confident grin he always had, gone. Instead, he gave me a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, Emma," he said softly. "You look good." I nodded. "Thanks, you too," I lied. We stood there in silence for a moment, that awkward kind where the past hovers like smoke you can't wave away. Then he said, "I've been thinking about you a lot." I took a sip of my coffee. "Yeah, I figured. 53 missed calls kind of gave that away." He winced. I deserved that. He started talking about how she wasn't who he thought, how it fell apart, how he'd been lost. The same recycled apology men always use when they realize peace doesn't wait for them. I listened, not out of kindness, but out of curiosity. It's funny how you can love someone so deeply once and feel absolutely nothing hearing their voice later. Then he said something that made me pause. "You know, I always admired you," he said quietly. "But being with you, it made me feel small. You never needed saving. You never needed me." I looked at him for a long second and then said, "Maybe that was the problem. You mistook partnership for dependency. I didn't need saving, Ben. I needed respect." He just stared at me. And for the first time, I think he actually saw me. Not the woman who cooked his meals, folded his shirts, or calmed his temper, but the one who walked away and never looked back. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote something, he said. It's not much, but I stopped him. Ben, I'm happy you're finding closure truly, but I've already found mine. And it didn't come in an apology. It came in peace. His hand froze midair. I could see the tears welling up, but it didn't move me. I'd spent years being the emotional caretaker. That job was officially closed. Before leaving, he said, "You're different now." I smiled. "No, Ben, I'm just finally myself." I walked out into the crisp fall air, feeling lighter than I had in years. As I passed the cafe window, I saw him still standing there, staring at the floor, holding that piece of paper like it might fix something, but it wouldn't. A few days later, Kelly and I were driving to a conference in Seattle when she said, "You ever think about him?" I laughed. "Only when Spotify plays old love songs I used to cry to. Now I just skip them and crank up Lizzo." She grinned. "Damn right you do." That night, in the hotel room, I scrolled through my photos. Pictures from the clinic, the hikes I'd gone on, my rescue dog Luna. There was no trace of the woman who used to wait for someone else's validation. I whispered to myself, "Look at you. You didn't just survive. You rebuilt." 2 weeks later, I got a letter. No return address, but I knew the handwriting instantly. I opened it slowly. It wasn't a love letter. It was a confession. He wrote that he'd started therapy, that he realized he used to measure love by control, not connection. "You didn't deserve the way I made you feel," he wrote. "You were my mirror, and I hated what I saw." I folded the letter and slipped it into a drawer, not out of nostalgia, but as a reminder that even people who break you can still teach you something. That night, I took Luna for a walk by the river. The city lights shimmered on the water, and I thought about how strange healing is, how it sneaks up on you when you least expect it. One day you wake up, and the person who hurt you isn't the headline anymore. You are. So yeah, he came back. But I didn't need revenge. His regret was loud enough. It's funny how peace doesn't make a sound when it arrives. It doesn't announce itself like heartbreak does. It just sort of slips in quietly one morning while you're making coffee, and you realize you haven't cried in months. That morning, the air was crisp, and the maple trees outside my apartment had started turning red. I opened the window, poured coffee into my favorite mug, yes, that mug, and watched the steam curl into the cold air. For a second, I thought about how something as simple as silence used to terrify me. Now it's my favorite song. Luna, my rescue dog, was curled up by the window, tail twitching in her sleep. A year ago, I couldn't even imagine having space in my heart for anything new. Now I couldn't imagine life without her. Funny how healing works. It doesn't ask for permission. It just happens while you're too busy living. Sometimes my coworkers still ask about Ben, not out of gossip, but curiosity. "Do you ever miss him?" they ask. I smile and say, "I miss who I thought he was." And that's the truth. Missing someone doesn't mean you want them back. It just means you're human enough to remember, but wise enough not to repeat. Last week, I ran into Mr. Henderson, my old neighbor, the one who helped me change the locks. He was watering his porch plants and called out, "Hey, nurse girl, still got that peace and quiet?" I laughed. More than ever. He nodded and said, "Good. That means you learned the hard lesson early. Some folks are lessons, not losses." And he's right. Every now and then, life hands you a story you didn't ask for. But if you're lucky, it ends with self-respect instead of resentment. I've stopped checking Ben's social media. Not out of bitterness, just disinterest. I heard he moved to another state, started over. Maybe he's better now, maybe he's not. Either way, it's not my story to follow anymore. I wish him peace, just not at the cost of mine. The other day, during a night shift, a younger nurse came up to me, crying in the break room. Her boyfriend had cheated on her, and she didn't know what to do. I didn't give her some motivational quote or tell her to move on. I just sat beside her, handed her a tissue, and said, "I've been there. You'll feel like the world's ending for a while. Then one day, you'll wake up, make coffee, and realize it isn't." She laughed through her tears. That's the thing about healing. It's not loud, but it's contagious. I've come to realize life isn't about getting even. It's about getting free. And freedom doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it's just quiet mornings, your own laughter, and the comfort of knowing you're no longer waiting for someone to see your worth. So no, peace doesn't need witnesses. It just needs you, choosing yourself again and again until it feels natural. And that's exactly what I'm doing now. You know, if there's one thing this whole mess taught me, it's that peace isn't something you stumble upon. It's something you decide to protect. For a long time, I thought strength meant holding on. Now I know it takes far more courage to let go. People always talk about closure like it's some grand moment, an apology, a confession, a dramatic ending. But sometimes, closure is just choosing not to reopen the wound. I used to believe silence was weakness, that walking away made me cold. But I've learned silence can be grace, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything. Life has this funny way of circling back. The same people who doubted you will one day have to sit with the weight of your absence. And that's not revenge. That's balance. Like my grandpa used to say, what goes around comes around, but it doesn't always need an audience. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. Your worth doesn't shrink because someone failed to see it. Don't chase explanations. Don't beg to be understood. Just live so loudly in your peace that their memory becomes background noise. They finally apologized months later. I read the message, smiled, and deleted it. No anger, no bitterness, just peace, on my terms this time. If this story spoke to you, tell me your thoughts below. Have you ever found peace after walking away from something that nearly broke you? Hit like if you've been there, and subscribe for more stories that remind you that quiet strength is still strength. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you're choosing calm over chaos, peace over revenge, and yourself, always yourself.